在 AI 时代，是什么让我们成为人类？心理学家和技术人员的回答。
Now everybody's having their individual social experiences. Like now, what I worry about with AI, with VR, with all these kind of technologies that are expanding, we all inhabit our own singular world. Like that is more frightening to me than like, that we all converge to the same experience. So, what makes a human a human?
It's one of those questions, isn't it? I mean, there's like two ways I would look at it. Like one is for my personal life and one is for my work life. Like one thing that's interesting is like there's been points when I've been spending like 4 to 5 hours a day interacting with AI. And the interesting thing that happens in that is the things that you notice, like when you first start interacting, like, oh, this is really realistic. Similar to like when people first had like black and white TV.
Yeah.
And they're like, wow, this is like real life. But then as you get used to it, you start to kind of realize like the things that make it less authentic. And I think something that I've realized with AI is like, there's certain ways that we interact that are just more spontaneous. Like there's something about the predictability of AI that teaches you about like the spontaneity of being human, the ways they communicate, the naturalness, the contextual awareness, like these little things that all add up. That's on the technical side. On the other side, I mean, I think there's something of just like the shared experience of being human that actually I think like differentiates it from like other animals' experience. Like, you have a traumatic moment in your life and then you start to resonate with other people's. Like, I feel like every time I've had something that's nearly catastrophic, it like opened up like a new door of empathy. And then you start to be like, oh man, that really hurt, Or like when you cry about something, you're like, wow. And then you start to remember, like, this is what usually happens to me. It's like, I start crying about something and then I think about all the things that like I did for my mom or my grandma and like all these kinds of things and the things that they felt. And I feel like that there's something in that kind of like shared experience where we have these things that like differentiate us. We're all different people, but there's something about like those common feelings that it all kind of arises from. But anyway, that's one thought.
I love that answer. And I'm going to say that you're not normal in that way. Here's why I don't think you're normal. People anthropomorphize anything. It doesn't have to even be that good, right? It doesn't have to be anywhere near as good as like AI for people to treat it like it has some like human characters. People treat their cars like they're people. So I'm surprised that when you interact with it a lot, it feels less real to you.
There's something about like, I think about like resolution. It's like the way of seeing the world. And like you kind of increase this, right? It's like the same reason you can't look at TV that's not 4K now. And it's someone I think who worked on like early VR was saying, the interesting thing about it was like when you stepped out of it, you're like, oh, the real world is actually amazing. And it's actually really hard to recreate that in technology. And I think the same is true for AI. Is like maybe for some people when they interact with it, the thing that they see is some commonality. But the thing that I always notice is like, well, this is very different from the conversations I have with my parents. Even though it's something similar, there's something off. And it's those little things that it's like, that's like, I think what over time will add up as people use AI more is they'll start to recognize, and I can't even point at them, like what are those nuances though that make us human?
You just know it when you see it and you're like, and it's missing in AI.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's also interesting because what you just suggested is that the more people use AI, the less real it's going to feel to people. You think that's what's going to happen?
I mean, there's probably another case, like, it's the same way as like, your Instagram and Facebook feed isn't a real conversation. But there are certainly kids especially who would look at those kinds of feeds and feel like, oh, that's a real representation of my friends or my, my favorite celebrities or whatever actually think. When it's like completely, well, I shouldn't say completely, largely false. And I do think something similar will happen with AI, where some people for sure will like almost be encaptured, and they will believe that like that's the most realistic thing that exists, and then start compare people to that. But I think that if you have that degree of empathy, you'll be like, oh, there's something off here. It's the same way as like even if you use a Zoom call, there's something off. It's like you can't. It's hard to pick it up, but like I'm not picking up all the signals, and it's the very little like nuances that you probably just subtly pick up as well.
So you don't think that the technology is going to advance quickly enough where it'll overcome those little things fast enough to capture all of us? You're not worried about that?
I am definitely worried about that, mainly because I think for most people it's easy, right? So the thing about AI is it's so beholden. At least if you think about like the chatbot styles, it's so beholden to what we want. And that's kind of like what people, I think, want a lot of people want in their life, or they need, is like the sense of control. And the AI gives you this sense that like, I can control this anthropomorphic thing. And that's honestly one of my fears, is that people get used to that. And what does it mean when like I get used to interacting with something that is beholden to only my views and interests, and then I go interact with a human who has their own interests?
And you think people want control? I think people want to be controlled.
Ooh. Maybe it's this form of control, though. To be controlled is a predictability, I guess.
Yeah, people want the world to make sense, don't you think?
Yes. Yes. I think they also want the world to be like there's something about like preferring predictability over optimality. So like I've even felt it like when you have like, you know, a mental health moment, you have friends who have mental health moments. Things that I've always seen as interesting is like your brain and your mind prefer to stay in a state that's familiar, even if it's worse. So if you're in like a depressed state, you almost would rather like stick in that than break outside of it, right? So there's something about like things that are familiar rather than actually like better. And that, I don't know, there's like a bias towards, you know, you almost identifying then with those kinds of states.
Yeah, there's research on this. One is called the status quo bias. People like things that are already there. And two, people like to have what they believe about themselves affirmed if they really believe them, even if they're not positive. So that is true. So like, what does that look like in AI?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely interesting to me that people seem to love, like, you know, you talk to a lot of these things and they sound like computers and they sound like AI, but people love it because it's kind of like it's familiar, it's controllable. You know, if you start to add lots of personalities and these kinds of things, it makes sense in context. But I found it interesting that like as we started developing these AI systems that people interact with, they all have this kind of like similar voice. It's a very AI voice. You can kind of tell that you're talking to an AI. Maybe that's intentional, but there is something there where like I think people have a preference to getting what they want from humans, and from AI, but that could blend. Like I think that there's already lots of, you know, people in certain demographics who spend a lot of time on the internet and they start to identify like that's their favorite form of interacting with people. And so I do think that there's a reality where like as we move into the future, there will be people who bias towards that for whatever reasons, you know, whether it's the comfort of knowing that someone's not judging them, whether it's like the format that it speaks to you with that will kind of bias towards, you know, preferring those types of interactions. But on the other hand, I always think that there will just be like, you know, there'll be a distribution of people. And you'll have some people who really don't like it. And, you know, like I was saying, the more that I interact with it, now I find it almost painful because I just pick up on so many of these issues that you're like, I can't even use it at a certain point. And, you know, you'd think that like, you know, I'm in the AI space. I write like 20-page docs. I don't use AI for a single bit of it because it does remove that voice. And I do also wonder though, is as people interact with it more, will they either identify the differences or start to conform to the things that they're trained with AI? It's the same as like, you know, if you interact with the same, you know, your partner, for example, right? You start to be biased by the communication because you're talking so much.
You mean they're training you?
They're training you, right? You're like, you know, your partner's probably like, you know, they have a preferred way of communicating. You get used to it, these kinds of things. So I do wonder if, as people interact with AI more, that they'll kind of all converge. That's probably one of my biggest fears, actually, of AI, is it causes convergence of, you know.
I'm concerned about the exact opposite. So I'm gonna shift a little bit. So when we talk about AI, what you're describing, it's usually like dyadic interactions. Like I'm interacting with one AI, it's one agent.
Yeah, that's true.
But really what people do is interact with multiple people, right? You interact in some community or some small group setting. And I'm surprised that there's not more of that in AI. So you're also in gaming. Like my understanding, I don't really game, but my understanding is a lot of the gaming is about connecting with the people, and it's a community kind of experience. So there's two things. One, I'm really surprised that AI seems so focused on these like one-on-one interactions as opposed to like multiple AI agents creating a more immersive social experience.
I love you brought up. That's literally what we do. So.
Okay, good. So that's one other thing. Like the reason I worry less about convergence and more about divergence is if you could produce a more immersive social experience, now everybody's having their individual social experiences. Like now, what I worry about with AI, with VR, with all these kind of technologies that are expanding what we can control about our social environment, about our physical perceptions in the environment, is that we all inhabit our own singular world. Like that is more frightening to me than like that we all converge to the same experience.
Well, my mom's a grade 7 teacher, and one thing that she says is really interesting is if you went back like 20 years, everybody was watching like the same TV shows, and they come to class and they'd all be talking about,
Yes.
Pokemon or whatever it was, and now everybody watches their own favorite YouTube channel.
Yes.
And it's the siloing of reality. So yeah, like what we do is when we work with games, for example, one of the interesting things is like as people play through games, it's basically the same thing. You could have a million people go through a game, and it's some differences, but you're largely going to hit the same points. And so one of the things that we think about is, what does that mean for agency? So, the way we interact with media changes the way that we feel agency in the world. So if we see inert media that we can't change, it also gives you this sense that like you can't change the world. And so to your point, one of the things that we want to do with games is how do you make it so that each person can actually influence that outcome? And as you add more agents into that you see, okay, I interact with this one, and it has a cascade effect,
Yes.
right? And that's like, I love it. I mean, even in some of the stuff we've done here, it's the magic actually happens when you do have those agents interacting, because then you're also not just seeing like that one-to-one interaction, but the emergent effect of basically that interaction. And another thing is if your main controls that you have in a computer is like point and click or, in the games, jump and shoot, we're trying to see like, what does it mean if social skills, like interaction like this, are the ways that you actually interact with the games or technology and the agents. Like that's a very different way of conversing or of dialogue than like button presses, right? And I think that changes the way that you sense agents in the world, because I think the way that most people change the world is by speaking, interacting with other humans, not by pressing buttons. I mean, arguably it's the case in some, but yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting to me is I don't think people have an understanding of the systems they exist in, right? People think about themselves as existing in like individual relationships, and they have a harder time understanding system effects. Like I affect you, which affects your partner, which affects your partner's parents, right? That is a harder thing to grasp, but I think there's something that's fundamentally human about that. Like you are also impacted by all these different things going on. Like we had the person come and put on our makeup, and now I'm looking beautiful, and that's affecting everybody else around me. But you know what I mean? Like, exactly. So, but how does that fit in? I just haven't heard people talk about it in that way, which is surprising to me, because that I think is what fundamentally makes humans human is interaction in complex social situations.
In these like nested systems. Yeah, and like they all affect each other, right? Like you think that your like small activity doesn't affect whatever higher level political stuff, but it's all aggregate.
Yes.
And it's all interlinking as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the AI thing is interesting too, because I often hear people talk about it as like this evolution, right? You have like singular cells to monkeys to humans to AI, whereas like you could flip it, right? Where it's like more like cells to organs to human to AI. It's a system overarching that just because it's trained on us and we do these things, we actually influence that system. Then it's kind of this, now that people are interacting with it, it has this interplay.
Yes.
And that's interesting too, when it becomes like, AI isn't this like singular entity. It is more of an institution or a system almost that is kind of overarching everything else.
Yeah, and it's also weird because it's like our vision of who we are. So when we talk about AGI, it's like we don't even know what intelligence is, and we think we're going to produce something that has it. It's just an interesting situation where we talk about it, as you said, it's natural evolution, but in fact, we're creating it, and it's not clear that we know exactly what it is we're creating.
I actually think that one of the most interesting things is that we're starting to work on AI at a point where like I still think we're figuring out ourselves. Like neuroscience is like very early on in its days, and yet we're creating things that are like based on our own intelligence. We don't really understand even what's going on inside. And so to your point on like what are the effects, we don't really know yet. We don't know. Every year a new paper comes out as like changes how people think about child rearing, right? Like how to bring up a child well, like all those kinds of things. And now we're creating systems that will kind of be overarching other humans. Like, what does that mean? I don't know. I do actually think I happen to be an AI. We happen to be at this point in time. But if we could pause for a second, I think it'd be good another few centuries of figuring out what we are and understanding that a little bit better before we created something that was in our image, because like we're kind of just, it's kind of like taking a photograph and like painting it, right? It's like you're not actually getting the person and painting it, right? Like it's like there's something about the life that's missing there. So I do agree. I think that we're honestly kind of premature, but I think it's just how I guess life goes, that things come out when they naturally should.
So I mean, you work in AI. So what's the most exciting thing for you in that? Like, what's your hope for it?
I think it's kind of back to that agency question. So, I mean, the way you read a news story, you read a book, you watch a movie, you watch a TV show, there's this, I mean, this is specific to like my domain. Like, there's something about a communication that we're having right now where like I'm adapting to the things that you say, to your body language, to all those kinds of things, right? To like, the people in the room, we have all these kinds of things. And so when you have AI able to sort of help that adaptation so that you have that agency in the things that you interact with. And I don't necessarily believe in like fully personalized media because I think we need like a shared social context.
Yeah.
Like the reason we watch a movie is because then we can all talk about it, right? We watch a TV show, we can all talk about it. But there is something about the fact that we're all interacting with these internet objects. And so, the way that technology feels, you're on a screen, it doesn't change. You're in a movie, it doesn't change. You're on, watching Netflix, it doesn't change depending on what you do. And I think that changes the way that we see our own agency in the world. And so I hope with AI that one of the things that it does is kind of opens this door to like agency in the way that we interact with media and technology in general, such that we do notice that effect that you have on systems. Because even if it's small, right, where like I take a certain action and it completely changes, an app, or it changes an experience, maybe that helps us learn that we have an effect in the social systems as well that we're affecting. So something to that effect.
So you wanted to make our agency more transparent.
Yeah.
And do you think it does that? Because right now, I'm not sure it doesn't obfuscate our agency.
No, I don't necessarily. No, yeah, I agree. I mean, this is why I think also like media and games is the domain I mainly focus on, and I think it's interesting, especially because young people use it a lot. And so like I've heard like very veteran game developers say, how people interact with games kind of trains kids how they should interact with the world. So even people who tend to like be professional players in different games have different like psychological profiles because they bias towards certain ways of interacting and like seeing the world. The same way, I guess, if you trained in something academic, right? You have a different way of viewing it. And so if we make games and media in a way that you feel that sort of social impact as well, maybe it opens the door to like another realm of understanding. But I agree that like a lot of the systems that we have today give you maybe a false sense also of agency, where like we were talking about the AI systems where, you actually feel like you're controlling this thing. Whereas maybe it's also biasing, and controlling or, having some influence over you as well.
So where do you think things are going? So there's obviously a huge race among some very, very well-resourced organizations over AI, right? Microsoft, Google, are the biggest maybe, but, and they are very quickly going to need to monetize it because this is what those companies are designed to do. Like, what do you foresee? Because I look at social media as an example. I think at the time when it first came out, people were really excited as a new way to connect with people, the way to stay connected to people. You couldn't otherwise catch up with people you lost contact with, that sort of thing, and it changed into something else. In large part because of the way it was monetized, I'd argue, like going to ads, focusing on attention. Like, what's the trajectory of AI?
I can't. I'm taking guesses.
We're all taking guesses. Of course, yeah. I won't hold it to you. Don't worry.
I mean, I think that the reality is, we were kind of mentioning before about the challenges of scale. And when you invest tens of billions of dollars in something, you need scale. And I think that's one of like the way that AI is developed, and specifically even the types of models we're using, the economic model of it, which is effectively the more compute you have, the better models you can create. The better models you can create, the more usage you get. The more usage you get, better. So it has somewhat of a honestly like monopolistic tendency, I think, in the way that actually even like the architectures and the economy of it works. And so I think it's almost inevitable that whatever AI systems are produced by these large organizations will be pushed to scale as quickly as possible. And there's maybe there's some pluses in that where like, sure, they're building in feedback loops, people can give their input, it biases it, but also at the same time, what does it mean when a single model is fit to 1 billion people, right? So like, that's kind of what I meant about the converging effect, where like, what happens when we are pushed to produce something that fits to like 1 billion people is there's a lot of diversity in there. And so, we create these scaled systems that are fitting with the whole, like trying to fit the whole planet. Like, does that work? And so I think what we're going to go through this phase where like, you're going to have 1 billion people interacting with the same AI. And I don't know what the effect of that will be. And I also don't know even like the monetization models now are kind of, you pay to use these kinds of things, which are maybe okay, but certainly ads will probably enter the equation. Also, what happens when like you want attention, and AI is much better than the algorithms you even have on YouTube and Instagram, and you can start to capture that attention. And so I certainly think it's going to be an interesting little bit here now as we see these huge organizations spending tens of billions of dollars and the choices that they make to then monetize that and what that means for like how AI proliferates, which is not, a lot of these, I know a lot of the folks in the organizations and their interests have never been in that domain, but at the same time, you're beholden, stock market interests and whatever it is, then what happens? Like it shifts it, right? We're in a capitalist world, and that's kind of like, what ultimately will change the incentives. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I am interested in, coming from your background, you have a very different stance on it. But, it's all this AI stuff is interesting. But, when you think, it's almost your first question, what makes us human? And like, as people, just technology in general, and specifically with AI, like, where can people find like the meaning in their life, the values that they, find true? Like, and how will that change, do you think, I guess, with like the advent of these new technologies? Or how do you even how have you seen it change with the technologies we've already seen come to life?
Yeah, I don't, this is going to sound like a funny answer. I think people are too worked up about technology, personally. I mean, we had this conversation. I think, people have been using technology since we've been human, right? So paper was a huge invention. Talked about this. The printing press, huge invention. Computer, huge invention. Internet, huge invention. AI, great, another huge invention. And through all of that, I think what you see in a lot of the biggest technologies is a desire to connect with other human beings. I think what fundamentally makes us human is our connection to other human beings, our ability to engage with other human beings, and like consciousness and all these other things I think are necessary preconditions. But really what makes us human is connections with other humans. And that is incredibly complex. Yeah. And I don't think we're close in terms of technology of replicating that. I mean, even what you described it, it's like you have this feeling of like, this isn't right, this is off. Like and even if you felt like it was right, it still would be off in ways you didn't quite get. I don't think we're close. Though, because it's designed to pull our attention away from other things, I think it impedes our ability to do what we all kind of want to do, which is interact with each other. Right. And it might change the way we interact with each other in a way that might feel less fulfilling. And I think you see some of that in social interactions now. Some of that, I mean, recently maybe COVID was an issue, but people feeling less comfortable in face-to-face interactions, right? Like people dating, there's no serendipity in hanging out, and you meet who you meet. It's like you're using an algorithm to try to present to you options. Like that's a very different world. So even that's prior to AI. And I don't know how AI is going to further influence that.
And I guess just even like at the general point, like how core do you think the need for connection is? In the sense that, I've heard some parents say that like through COVID, their kids went through like a major change, like, these regressions in their, their different habits and these kinds of things because they weren't connecting with people. And then it's taken years to overcome that. So I do also wonder, like, whether it's through technology or things like COVID or just like circumstances, could we lose that need for connection, or that even desire, even if we need it, we might lose the desire for it and feel, emotional trauma as a result, but still not go for it. Like how core do you think it is? And do you think we're safe in that kind of need?
So I'm going to give you the most extreme answer, which is I think the true one, that you will cease to be human if you don't have a need for human connection. Like I think you will be a physical person, but you will literally break down as a human being. And this is why in part social isolation or solitary confinement is considered inhumane, because people literally break down. You will start to have hallucinations. You will break down mentally and physically absent human connection. So I don't think there's no possibility in my mind of losing the need. Like you may get less than you need, and that will have negative consequences for you. But I'm not worried about people not wanting to be around people.
Are you worried that like things like social media or AI or any of these things could give you that sense that you're fulfilling that need, but not actually fulfilling it. You know, you said like it's totally true, right? Solitary confinement is a great example.
Yeah.
Because we need it. We absolutely like lose our sanity as well as, you know, our well-being. But maybe technology can manufacture the sense that we're fulfilling it. And then over time we see, you know, these mental health crises evolve as a result.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's unlikely, but I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think I'll talk about meaning for a second, and I think of that as fundamentally tied to our need for connection to other people. I think sometimes we confuse, for example, our need for meaning with a desire for personal achievement, that we chase personal achievement, and what we're trying to do is generate meaning. So I think we can be confused, and we can have those needs displaced into less productive routes. But I don't think it's going away, but you know, I don't know that it's the healthiest.
Yeah. No, I'm totally aligned.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was an awesome conversation.
Yeah, it was great. It was fun to talk to you.
Super fun.
Yeah, it was really fantastic and super informative. Thank you.
恳请点赞，订阅我们的频道，一起学习演讲中的实用英语。